Our world leaders are meeting in Azerbaijan's capital, Baku, where the UN climate change summit, known as COP29, is now underway. A delegation from Afghanistan is in Baku, where they are expected to attend the conference for the first time since the Taliban took power in 2021. Now, the Taliban's government is not internationally recognized. Their representatives at the climate summit are expected to be limited to observer status. Delegates from nearly 200 countries are meeting for the climate talks for 2 weeks with a goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees. And this year's talks in particular are focused on climate assistance to developing countries. All right, let's get more on this now from Graeme Smith in Rome, a senior consultant for Crisis Group's Asia program focusing on Afghanistan. Welcome to DW. Can I ask you, why should the Taliban be welcomed at COP29, given their human rights record?
It's very important for the human rights of Afghan girls and women that the Taliban go to COP29 and that Afghanistan start to regain access to climate financing so that the world can get involved again in helping the country to adapt to the terrible effects of climate change. It's getting harder and harder to be a farmer in Afghanistan. Droughts and floods are worsening, and agriculture is the biggest employer of women outside of their homes. And the terrible effects of the country drying up fall most heavily on women and girls. Tens of thousands have been displaced just this year because of extreme weather. When you go and talk to the doctors who deal with malnutrition, it's the little girls who are dying the most in those feeding centers. So, really, the most vulnerable people in the country desperately need help with climate adaptation, and getting the Taliban to this conference is a good first step.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you've made very clear the effect on the individuals, especially women and girls. But just to come back to the point, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights stated just a few days ago that the human rights situation in Afghanistan continues to get worse. So, again, is it really ethical to involve the Taliban in climate talks, given their extremely oppressive policies?
I think it's an ethical imperative to bring all countries, including the Taliban regime, into these talks because we have to do something to help the most impoverished Afghans, and especially women and girls, to survive the worsening climate. And to say otherwise, I think, is to propose a sort of political theory that shutting the Taliban out of conferences like this will make them change their minds about their draconian policies towards limiting the rights of women and girls, that somehow the religious leaders in Kandahar would say, oh, we haven't been invited to this conference, and so therefore we will change our minds about our social restrictions. I think that's absurd, and I think anyone who studies the Taliban knows that's absurd. And that's why you're seeing aid workers on the ground begging for access to these kinds of climate financing mechanisms so that work can resume on water infrastructure and some of these basic needs of Afghans.
Mm-hmm. If there is this outreach to the Taliban, they are included in talks like this. The question, of course, is can one trust any promises the Taliban make in this instance on climate, given the lack of transparency, in Afghanistan?
I think a lack of trust is one of the hallmarks of the international system now. When you're talking about countries with dubious human rights records, coming to these summits, I have to say China is invited. The United States is invited. We're coming into a world now where multilateralism is under a lot of pressure. And so I think there is a necessity to have some things like climate change supersede other agendas and be part of a sort of basic operating system of multilateralism.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the effects of climate change on Afghanistan earlier. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the effects on Afghanistan and whether the Taliban has made any moves at all to tackle any of these issues?
Yeah, the Taliban have actually been spending some of their meager budgets on large-scale water infrastructure. and moving ahead in a sort of surprising way. They don't deny the climate science. They have always positioned themselves as environmental stewards, which is sort of surprising. And so I think there is a possibility of working with them on these things. And yeah, my colleagues at Crisis Group and our data team have modeled the drought flood cycles that are getting worse and worse and sharper with every passing year. So it is rather alarming when you start to look at some of the graphs. And I think that is why there was an effort last year to get the Taliban to the UAE for COP28. Didn't quite work out. This year, COP29 was a close-run thing. I think they are relegated to observer status, as you noted, and even how the degree to which they can participate on the sidelines might be circumscribed. But bit by bit, they are going to have to be drawn into these discussions because it is a truly universal problem.
Graeme Smith from the Crisis Group's Asia programme. Graeme, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.